Hey y'all, Caitlin Albritton of Caitlin Albritton Jewelry here today, and we're going to be talking about how to fill in those little pesky holes, divots, pits, cavities, whatever you want to call them on the surface of your cabochon. Usually you'll start seeing them around the 280 resin to 600 resin wheel stage. As you're looking at it, you see everything kind of has a nice smooth surface, except you might see a little hole here and there. And I know some people might say, well, keep grinding until you get rid of it. Well, I have two reasons why I use these techniques. One is you might have material that has little micro bubbles throughout the whole stone. So if you cut, and you might be cutting down and getting rid of the divot in one section, another cavity pops up somewhere else. So you could just keep chasing cavities until you don't have a stone anymore. The second reason I use this technique is I used bubble opal, which is a chatoyant material, and I like having a certain dome on it. If I cut any more, it will get rid of all the chatoyants and I've completely ruined the stone. So that's why I like to use this technique if there's just a little cavity that I need to fill to have that nice smooth surface over the whole stone. Now this technique shouldn't be kind of used interchangeably with stabilizing. Stabilizing is for if you have a piece of material and the crack actually goes all the way through the slab or the stone, that you need to stabilize it to kind of hold in the structural integrity of the stone. This is just kind of filling a pocket. So this and that are different. So don't use this if you need to stabilize. But besides that, I hope you guys enjoyed the tutorial today.
This first technique is good for smaller pits, say nothing bigger than about 1 millimeter. Here I've got a piece of oolite cut to 280 on my resin wheels, and it's pretty, but it's kind of Swiss cheesy in areas, and it kind of ruins the whole polished look that I'm going for. Before we do any filling, I like to remove all the moisture from my cabs with a candle warmer. And as a reminder, I have a list of all the tools and materials you'll need in the description below, as well as a link if you'd like to donate and support my lapidary tutorials. For these smaller pits, I tend to use Starbond CA glue. Here I'm using a medium thickness, and they also make a thin, medium thick, and so on. But this is a nice middle ground. The consistency is somewhere along the lines of melted butter or kind of like a thick water. It comes with a precision applicator tip, but I find that it's a little too easy to apply too much glue. So I prefer to use something like an upcycled lid to put, some into, and then use a mixing stick to dip it into there and then apply directly to the pit. So to get a little close up, I'm just dabbing glue directly on the spots that need filling. I like to use a mixing stick that I've already mixed epoxy with, so it has a kind of dried coating of it on it, or else the wood is just going to soak up all your CA glue, and then you'll wonder where it went. It's in your stick. So Here I like to apply a few beads of that glue until it forms a slight bulge from the surface, but I try to keep it just on the spot that needs filling without getting it everywhere else, if at all possible. And as a pro tip, I know you've seen me use these spring clamps in other projects like the Intarsia, but I take off the little red flat part on them and use it as a third arm to hold my cab so I don't glue myself to my rock, and it also helps if I want to fill pits on the bottom of my stone too. Starbond tends to dry relatively quickly if it's applied in a small hole or in thin layers, so say maybe 15 minutes, but you could always decide to get a spray accelerator that speeds up the drying time, so if you have a thin layer, it's like ready to go right away. Just shake it up, spray your cab in a well-ventilated area, and you're good to go. But just so you know, the accelerator won't work for deep pockets of CA glue, so you still will have to wait those out for a little bit longer than that. So here's the cab after one coat of Starbond that's dried, and some holes have filled up completely while others you can still see the dip where I need to do a few more layers to fill it up. As I was applying the second layer, I noticed an air bubble got trapped, so you can use something like a small safety pin or something like that to pop that bubble. So I may or may not have dropped my cab on the table and got glue all over the top of it, so it looks like a hot mess. Some pits I had to do at least 5 layers on it since they were a lot deeper than I had expected, while others filled up with just one application. But at this point, it's hard to tell if I need to do more applications or whatnot because it's impossible to read the surface. So I'm going to actually cut down some of the CA glue with the 280 resin wheel so we can reevaluate the surface from here. This is after cutting back some of the CA glue, and I'm glad I stopped here because all of my pits are in fact filled. At this point, we want to carefully inspect the surface of our cab because we want to cut all the glue back so it's just in the pockets and not just a big lump over the surface. There's a few ways you can tell you haven't cut enough of the glue. The first sign is that the glue has a different sheen than the stone, and it's usually in the shape of a big blob around the pit that you just filled. Sometimes it will even show a bit of like a whitish halo, like it kind of does here in this spot, or you might see like a little shadow from the glue not cut flush with the surface. Now, why does it matter how much glue you cut? Here's a cabochon that I polished to, gosh, I think like 4,000 mesh, where I left a blob of glue instead of cutting it down. And it just stands out like a sore thumb. You can see it from really far away. And you can see it from the side profile. There's even that flap of glue sticking up because it doesn't have that pit to hold on to. Basically, it just doesn't look good. So you want to make sure you get it all cut down the first time around. Back at the oolite, we've done another round of the 280 resin wheel, and you can see that the glue sheen is starting to take on the shape of the holes that they're filling. So it's a really nice seamless look, and we're ready to keep moving along in the polishing stages. And here we are all polished, and I'd say your regular person wouldn't even know you filled like 10 little pockets here, but it's still good to let people know if you're planning on selling these. Now, there are some things I don't like about CA glue, one being that it can be a little finicky when you're trying to use oxides or polishing compounds. Usually, like the smaller pits are fine, but if the pit is kind of broad, like I would say, 2.5 or more millimeters, it tends to get this weird like orange peel texture when you use those compounds, which is kind of annoying. You can't really get rid of it. I also feel like it's just not as strong or long lasting as the second method, so I use CA glue pretty sparingly in my pieces. But a perk is that it can be a really nice fast option for tiny pinhead sized holes. On to method 2, which is a bit more preferred for me. It's great to use for any pits, small to large, and to test that theory, we're going to do this sample with Florida agatized coral that has some pretty big gaps in this honeycomb-like structure. Now, this is a really, really extreme example though. Like I'd probably never fill gaps this massive, and actually I think it looks cool or natural, but whatever, we're just going to go ahead and do it. Here I'm using Epoxy 330, and I'm eyeballing equal parts hardener to resin, then mixing them together thoroughly with my mixing stick. Then using the same technique as the CA glue, I'm using the mixing stick to apply the glue directly into the holes, and I'm trying to get the glue to go down deep in there, but also trying not to create any air pockets, so just keep an eye out for those and pop them before the glue hardens. Now that I've filled everything, the surface is slightly bowed out where I've applied the epoxy, but the epoxy itself is flush. So now I'm going to let this cure for 24 hours, and then we can evaluate if we need to fill anything else. And I came back to this cab the next day, and it's hard to tell if I've actually filled all their gaps or if those little ripples there mean it's not filled. So I'm going to go ahead and mix another small batch of epoxy. If you don't want to do that, you could always cut it and then see if you need to apply epoxy. It's just kind of preference at this point. Now for your project, you probably won't have to do a second round of epoxy, but this is the second batch of filling, and it's cured for 24 hours. It looks much better. Now I can start cutting back the glue flush with the surface of the stone. I've done a little work on the 280 wheel here, just to stop and show you, but it's a little trickier to spot where the glue still needs to be cut down because this cab is white. But the same kind of idea, technique with the CA glue, you're looking for the texture of the stone. And in this case, there are little micro pores on the surface of the coral, and that lets me know where I still need to cut down the glue that has a different kind of sheen and texture. But besides using your eyes, you can also use your ears to help determine whether you need to keep cutting down that layer of glue hiding the surface of your stone. Now this technique only works with the diamond wheel, not the resin wheel, so I'm using 220 diamond. When the diamond runs across the glue, the sound is softened or seems muffled, but when it runs across the stone, it gets a little bit of a higher pitch back. Because I had such a thick layer of glue, you hear that muffled sound consistently until the coral emerges. Then you might hear it interspersed with the higher pitch of the stone grinding down. Here is the muffled sound of the glue. And the higher pitch of the stone here. Now that the glue is cut down with the 280 wheel, you can see the nice coral texture on the little round parts of the stone between the epoxy gaps. I think there was only one small pit on the other side of the cab that I missed, but I'm just going to leave it as is and finish this up. Here we're all polished, and even though this is a ridiculous example of how to fill pits, it just shows it works. I think the only problem here is that I had a micro bubble that didn't pop and it ended up coming to the surface when I cut it down. But you could always do a little touch up if you feel like it, or if you want to go nuts, you could use the vacuum to remove all those bubbles before the epoxy sets.
Also note, I did find that the epoxy does much better with oxides and polishing compounds than the CA glue, which is a big plus for me. Now onto a few troubleshooting tips with either technique. You might have some stones that when you go to cut them, it just pulls the whole CA glue or epoxy plug right out, like in some sections on the backs of this bubble opal here. If you're using CA glue, I recommend cleaning the pit with an alcohol-soaked Q-tip, letting it dry, and then trying it with epoxy, since that has a bit more holding power in my opinion. But I will say there are some pits that just won't fill because of the material itself. Some little pits in materials like labradorite or quartz or like this bubble opal, I know it's a quartz-based opal. If you're trying to adhere things, it's like adhering things to glass. There's just nothing for the glue to hold on to physically. So when you go to add the friction of the cabbing wheels, it just rips the whole plug right out. So I guess what I'm trying to say is pick your battles wisely. Sometimes you just need to let it go. Then before you go, here's a little bonus tip for porous material like this piece of fossil bone that Jonathan from Family Fossil Hunters sent me from South Carolina. I love the texture of this material, but even when it's at a final polish like this, it looks like my ashy elbows during winter, so we're going to fix that. I'm basically going to lather the whole surface of the stone with a thin layer of the Starbond CA glue and let that seep in. Now, instead of starting at the 280 resin wheel, I actually started at like 1200 and then finished polishing, so that even after it dries, the stone retains its rich yellow color. Well, that's it for today. If you've been enjoying my lapidary videos, let me know in the comments or consider donating to my tutorial fund to help support more videos coming up. The link for that and other information is in the description below. Thanks again for joining me in the studio today. Take care, y'all.